peace was disrupted began with the arrival of Patricia Wellington, a woman who carried herself with an air of entitlement and a demeanor that suggested she believed she was destined for leadership. Before Patricia's campaign, life in the Maple Grove Estates neighborhood had been quiet and largely uneventful. For the protagonist, the 3 years spent in the community were peaceful, marked by little more than the occasional HOA reminders about lawn maintenance and the annual holiday decoration debates. While the HOA's rules were strict, they were no more intrusive than what any other suburban neighborhood might expect, and it seemed like a fair trade-off for the quiet, tree-lined streets and the sense of community they enjoyed. But Patricia's candidacy for HOA president changed everything. She was a woman who seemed to radiate an aura of superiority, with perfectly styled blonde hair, designer athleisure, and an unshakable confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her campaign was not the typical run for office. Patricia didn't just knock on doors to ask for support, she arrived armed with a binder filled with community improvement proposals. There was no warmth in her smile, only a cold sense of entitlement, and when she spoke, her words carried an undertone of condescension. "We need to restore Maple Grove to its former glory," she declared at the first community meeting, her eyes scanning the room with judgment. "Some residents have been allowing standards to slip, and that ends now." The protagonist immediately recognized the underlying threat in her words, particularly when Patricia's gaze lingered on the protagonist's home. The protagonist had recently installed solar panels, a significant investment they had made with all the proper permits and HOA approvals. The solar panels represented not just an effort to save on energy bills but also a commitment to a more sustainable, environmentally friendly lifestyle. The protagonist knew they were in the right, and they had worked diligently to ensure everything was up to code. But Patricia saw them and their solar panels as part of the problem, a disruption to her ideal vision of community aesthetics. When Patricia won the election, the protagonist braced for the inevitable changes. The new HOA guidelines Patricia proposed were soon put into effect, and it didn't take long for the first violation notice to arrive. The protagonist stood frozen at their front door as they read the letter, which accused them of violating new architectural guidelines regarding the solar panels. The letter's passive-aggressive tone made it even worse, and the protagonist's blood began to boil. The notice was not just a bureaucratic annoyance, it was an attack on their rights, their home, and their commitment to sustainability. They had followed all the rules, had received all the necessary approvals, yet now Patricia was attempting to retroactively strip them of their hard-earned investment. Frustration quickly turned to anger as the protagonist dialed the HOA office, only to be told by Patricia's new assistant that Patricia was too busy to discuss individual violations. The protagonist felt their patience wearing thin, but they weren't about to let this go. Armed with the approval documents, they drove straight to Patricia's house, feeling the weight of their resolve grow with every mile. When Patricia opened the door, the expression on her face, cold and dismissive, only fueled the fire inside the protagonist. Patricia's tone was condescending, and when she brushed aside their legal paperwork with a wave of her hand, the protagonist's patience snapped. "The panels are staying," the protagonist declared firmly, a sense of determination rising within them. "They were legally approved, and you can't retroactively deny them. If you persist with these fines, I'll take legal action." The protagonist's voice was steady, but inside, their anger churned. Patricia's eyes narrowed, and she responded with thinly veiled contempt, suggesting they would handle things officially. As the door slammed in the protagonist's face, the seething frustration turned into a cold sense of resolve. Patricia had no idea what she had just started. The next few days were a blur of research and consultations with a lawyer, who confirmed the protagonist's rights were solid. They couldn't force the removal of legally approved solar panels, this was a fight they could win. But the protagonist hadn't anticipated the full extent of Patricia's recklessness. One afternoon, as the protagonist worked from home, the lights suddenly flickered and went out. At first, it seemed like a random outage, but as the protagonist went outside to check the electrical panel, they were met with a horrifying sight. The wires connecting their solar panels to the power grid had been deliberately cut. A surge of anger and disbelief flooded through the protagonist. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was sabotage. As the protagonist stood there, fuming, their neighbor Jeff came running over. "Hey, is your power out too?" "The whole street just went dark," he said, his confusion matching the protagonist's own. That's when the truth dawned on them. Patricia hadn't just disabled their solar panels, she had created a surge that knocked out power to the entire block. The protagonist's heart raced as they realized the magnitude of Patricia's mistake. They quickly pulled out their phone and dialed 911, watching as more neighbors emerged from their homes, all equally bewildered by the sudden blackout. As the police arrived and the situation began to unfold, the protagonist couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. Patricia had just made a catastrophic error, and the protagonist had security footage to prove it. What she hadn't considered in her haste to enforce her personal agenda was that her actions had far-reaching consequences, not just for the protagonist but for the entire neighborhood. The police investigation revealed just how serious the situation was. Officer Martinez, after reviewing the footage, explained that tampering with electrical infrastructure wasn't just vandalism, it was a public safety issue, one that could have led to fires or worse. The implications of Patricia's actions were far more severe than anyone had imagined. The protagonist couldn't help but feel vindicated as they watched the growing crowd of neighbors, all demanding answers, all ready to hold Patricia accountable for her reckless behavior. In the aftermath of the power outage, the protagonist realized that Patricia's attempt to impose her will on the community had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that would expose far more than just her vendetta against their solar panels. Patricia's arrogance and disregard for the law had turned her into a pariah in the community, and the protagonist was more determined than ever to ensure that she faced the consequences of her actions. This was no longer just about solar panels, it was about justice, about standing up for what was right, and about protecting the neighborhood from a leader who cared more about her own vision than the well-being of the people she was supposed to serve. The conflict over my solar panels quickly escalated beyond a simple disagreement, it became a full-blown clash of ideals. What started as a seemingly minor issue with Patricia Wellington, the newly elected HOA president, soon revealed itself to be a battle of values. Patricia represented the old ways, the conservative, status quo approach to neighborhood life, where change was viewed with suspicion and anything new, particularly anything that disrupted the aesthetic of the community, was to be resisted at all costs. She embodied the perfect HOA president to people like her, meticulously groomed, outwardly friendly, but ultimately insistent on maintaining an idealized image of the neighborhood. For her, the community was about appearances and conformity, where every house was a reflection of a perfect suburban ideal. I, on the other hand, represented something different. My decision to install solar panels wasn't just about saving money on my electric bill, it was a declaration of my values, a stand for sustainability and progress. It was about contributing to something bigger than myself, about reducing my carbon footprint and investing in the future of the planet. I had followed all the rules. I had obtained the necessary permits, gone through the required channels, and had even received approval from the HOA under the previous administration. I wasn't expecting a problem, and for a while, there wasn't one. But once Patricia took office, that all changed. When I first received the violation notice, I felt a surge of anger, but also a profound sense of injustice. How could she retroactively deny the approval that had been granted? The sense of being wronged settled deep in my chest, and it wasn't just about the panels anymore, it was about Patricia's arrogant presumption that she could change the rules on a whim. It wasn't just an attack on my property, it felt like an attack on my right to choose how to live my life, how to contribute to the world around me. I was determined to stand my ground. I knew that I was in the right legally, and I wasn't about to let her bully me into submission. The thought of removing those panels felt impossible. They were a part of my home now, a symbol of my commitment to a more sustainable future. But it wasn't just about principle anymore. When Patricia threatened me with fines and attempted to dismiss my legal rights with a wave of her hand, I realized how far she was willing to go to enforce her narrow vision of the neighborhood. The coldness in her eyes when she dismissed me, the way she belittled my efforts, those moments made me burn with frustration. Her condescending attitude only fueled my determination to fight back. I wasn't just protecting my property, I was standing up for the values I believed in. Then came the moment that pushed everything to a breaking point, when I discovered that Patricia had taken matters into her own hands by cutting the power lines connecting my solar panels to the neighborhood grid. I still remember the sick feeling that washed over me when I walked outside to find my electricity down and saw the severed cables hanging from the power lines. At first, I thought it was a random outage. But as I inspected the damage, it became painfully clear what had happened. I had never imagined that she would take such extreme action, but there it was. Patricia had decided to sabotage my solar setup, and in doing so, she had disrupted power to the entire block. My heart sank as I realized the full extent of what she had done. The outrage that had bubbled inside me turned into something darker: betrayal. She hadn't just tampered with my home. She had created chaos for everyone on the block. The ripple effect of her actions became instantly clear as I stepped outside and saw my neighbors scrambling to figure out what had happened. I could see Jeff, a neighbor of mine, running up to me, his face filled with confusion as he asked if my power was out too. The whole street had gone dark. It wasn't just my house. Patricia's reckless actions had disrupted the entire neighborhood. My mind raced as I stood there, trying to process the enormity of it all. The very thing she had hoped to use as leverage, my solar panels, had caused a major power failure. I was furious, but I knew that anger alone wouldn't fix this. I had to act. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. The police arrived soon after, and I led them to my electrical panel where the damage was obvious. I could see the shock in the officers' eyes as they took in the sight of the cut cables. But even more than that, they understood the potential danger of what had happened. Officer Martinez, who was taking the lead in the investigation, immediately recognized the severity of tampering with electrical infrastructure. "This isn't just vandalism," she explained, her voice serious. "This is a public safety issue. You could have caused fires or worse." The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. Patricia's actions were reckless and dangerous, and I couldn't let her get away with it. But as I stood there, watching the officers take statements, a small, quiet sense of satisfaction began to form. I had security cameras. And those cameras had captured everything. The following day, as I sat in the police station with Detective Chin, I felt a sense of grim determination. She had already reviewed the footage and seen the evidence. Patricia's actions were inexcusable, and now the legal repercussions of her decisions were becoming more clear. As the detective sipped her coffee, she slid a folder across the table, the contents revealing the full extent of the damage. My neighbors were coming forward with statements of their own: damaged electronics, lost food, flooded basements. "This isn't just about you anymore," Detective Chin said. "This is about the whole neighborhood. You're not the only one who suffered." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Patricia's actions had caused a ripple effect of harm that went far beyond my home, and now the community was rallying together against her. As the days passed, news of Patricia's arrest spread, and with it came the revelation of even more of her misconduct. It turned out that this wasn't the first time she'd been involved in HOA controversy, and as the investigation unfolded, people started digging into her past. Documents surfaced that painted a troubling picture of her history with homeowners associations. It became clear that she had used her position of power to push her own agenda at the expense of the very people she was supposed to serve. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of vindication, watching her fall from grace as her secrets were exposed. By the time the HOA meeting took place, Patricia's fate was sealed. The room was packed with irate neighbors, all of them detailing the ways in which Patricia's actions had impacted their lives. When she tried to defend herself, it was clear that no one was buying her excuses. Her earlier efforts to maintain the perfect, idyllic image of the neighborhood had backfired spectacularly. The truth had come out, and she couldn't hide behind her designer clothes and perfect smile anymore. In the end, Patricia was removed from her position, but the damage she had done to the community wasn't so easily erased. Still, the silver lining was that the HOA, now under new leadership, began to embrace progressive changes. New guidelines were adopted to promote sustainable energy, and more residents began installing solar panels. The sense of unity that emerged from this conflict was undeniable. As for Patricia, she sold her house and left the neighborhood, presumably to find a place where she could continue her reign without interference. I still smile every time I look at my solar panels. They stand as a testament to resilience, to fighting for what's right, and to the belief that progress, in the end, will always shine brighter than those who try to stand in its way. When I discovered that the power lines connected to my solar system had been deliberately cut, a rush of disbelief and anger flooded through me. At first, I stood frozen, staring at the clean, precise severing of the wires, not fully processing what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. I thought maybe it was an accident, some kind of malfunction. But as I stepped closer, the full weight of what had happened hit me, and I realized that this was no random glitch. Someone had intentionally destroyed my property, and in doing so, they had created a serious risk not only for me but for the entire neighborhood. The first feeling that gripped me was shock. I couldn't believe that something so malicious could happen in our quiet, peaceful community. I had worked hard to install the solar panels, getting all the proper permits and HOA approvals, fully expecting to be left alone to enjoy the benefits of renewable energy. Now, someone had violated that right in the most personal way possible. But the shock quickly gave way to a rising anger, a burning sense of injustice. I felt like I had been personally attacked. The fury wasn't just about the destruction of my property, it was about the complete disregard for the safety and well-being of everyone in the neighborhood. As I stood there, trying to process everything, a deep sense of helplessness washed over me. What if this act had caused more than just an inconvenience? What if someone's home had caught fire because of this? What if there had been more severe damage to the electrical grid? The gravity of the situation hit me all at once, and I knew that I couldn't just let it slide. I had to do something, not just for myself, but for the community. My anger transformed into determination. This wasn't just about a personal violation, it was about holding someone accountable for endangering everyone around them. I immediately pulled out my phone and started recording everything. I needed evidence, something solid to back up my claims. I couldn't just hope that people would believe me. I had to show them what had happened. My hands were shaking with a mixture of anger and adrenaline, but I focused on documenting everything as clearly as possible. Every severed wire, every small detail that might help prove that this was no accident. Then, I called the power company. My voice was tight with frustration, but I tried to remain calm as I explained the situation. I needed them to come out immediately, to fix the damage, and to assess the broader impact. As soon as I hung up, I dialed the police. The realization that this was now a criminal act, a blatant act of vandalism that endangered public safety, hit me like a punch to the stomach. I couldn't sit idly by while someone walked away from this without facing consequences. While I waited for the authorities to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. I felt a rising sense of dread. What if the damage was worse than I thought? What if the entire block had been affected by this? The thought that the entire neighborhood might have lost power because of this one person's reckless decision only fueled my anger. I couldn't stand still. I kept pacing, checking the phone for updates, replaying the events in my mind over and over again. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How dare they? How could someone be so reckless, so entitled, as to cause this much harm without a second thought? When the police and utility workers finally arrived, it felt like a small relief. Officer Martinez's calm, professional demeanor as she took the statements helped ease some of the tension in my chest. But it was the look in her eyes, determination, seriousness, that really reassured me. She wasn't dismissing this as a minor issue. She understood the potential danger. She looked at the footage I'd captured, taking careful notes, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. This wasn't just a case of petty vandalism, this had much larger implications. But while I felt a sense of validation that the authorities were taking it seriously, my anger didn't subside. It only simmered beneath the surface, growing with each passing moment. I couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about getting my solar panels fixed. This was about making sure this kind of reckless behavior didn't go unpunished. I wanted justice, not just for me, but for the whole community. I watched as the utility crew worked to assess the damage, their serious faces reflecting the same concerns I had. It wasn't just about the immediate effects of the damage, but the long-term impact on everyone's safety. Every time they spoke, it only solidified my resolve. I couldn't let Patricia get away with this. She needed to face the consequences of her actions, and I was going to make sure of it. The frustration and helplessness that had initially overwhelmed me had transformed into an unshakable drive to ensure that justice would be served. As the hours passed, and the police continued their investigation, I realized that this was just the beginning. There would be more steps, more obstacles to overcome. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let this go. The moment the police arrived, I felt a surge of mixed emotions: relief, frustration, and a deep sense of justice finally starting to take shape. I had spent the last few hours seething with anger, pacing around my home, unable to fully process what had just happened. I had known, deep down, that Patricia's actions would catch up with her, but standing there in front of the police felt surreal. For a brief second, I wondered if I had done enough to prove my case, if the security footage would truly be enough to bring this situation to a resolution. But the weight of the situation was becoming clearer with each passing second. Officer Martinez, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, immediately took control of the scene. Her sharp eyes took in the severed wires, and without any hesitation, she turned to me. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an edge that suggested she was used to handling serious matters. I didn't waste any time. I explained everything I knew: how my solar panel setup had been deliberately sabotaged, how I had been dealing with Patricia's increasingly aggressive HOA demands, and how I suspected her involvement. As I spoke, my anger bubbled to the surface again. My words came out faster, more forcefully. It was like the floodgates had opened. "I don't understand it, officer," I continued, trying to keep my composure. "This isn't just about the solar panels. It's about power, her need to control everything, even when it's illegal. Cutting my wires didn't just harm me, it harmed the entire neighborhood." Officer Martinez nodded slowly, her expression unchanged as she made notes in her pad. She didn't interrupt, but I could feel her evaluating the situation carefully. She looked over at the wire cutters and then back at the severed cables, her eyes narrowing in thought. "I'll need to see any evidence you have," she said after a moment, her voice steady. I quickly pulled out my phone and showed her the security footage from my cameras, the footage I had reviewed in the hours leading up to the police arrival. Watching it again made my stomach churn with a fresh wave of disgust. There she was, Patricia, confidently walking up to my electrical panel in her pristine yoga pants and expensive sneakers, cutting the wires like it was no big deal. The image of her calmly committing the act sent a cold shiver down my spine. How could someone be so reckless and cruel? Officer Martinez studied the footage closely, her expression grim. She didn't say anything for a long moment, but when she did, her voice was low and firm. "This is a serious matter. Tampering with electrical infrastructure isn't just a petty crime, it's a public safety issue. You're lucky it didn't cause a fire or worse." Her words sank in like a heavy weight, and my anger morphed into something else, something deeper. This wasn't just a nuisance. This was an attack on my home, on my livelihood, and on my community. The thought that Patricia's actions had created such a volatile situation, where the entire neighborhood was affected, made me realize how little she thought of the consequences. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood just how reckless her behavior had been. "We'll need to speak with the neighbors, take statements," Officer Martinez said, her tone now commanding as she turned to her partner. I watched as the officers began speaking to my neighbors, who had started to trickle out of their homes, concerned about the power outage. Some had lost perishable food in their refrigerators, others had been late for work or school, and a few had medical equipment that relied on electricity. I felt a sense of rising dread as I listened to their complaints, their frustration mounting the longer the outage lasted. But at the same time, there was a glimmer of satisfaction. Everyone knew it wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just bad luck. It was Patricia's deliberate, thoughtless action. As the hours passed and more utility workers arrived, I felt the weight of what had happened press down harder on my chest. The damage was more extensive than I had realized. It wasn't just about my solar panels, it was about the ripple effect of Patricia's interference. The entire block had been impacted, and I could see the frustration building among my neighbors as they began to piece together what had happened. Officer Martinez's voice brought me back to the present. "We'll need to file a report and follow up on the charges," she said, her gaze sharp. "But I think it's safe to say that this is more than just vandalism. This is a criminal act with serious consequences." Her words were the confirmation I needed. Patricia had underestimated the situation. She had thought she could act with impunity, that no one would notice or care. But now, the full scope of her actions was becoming clear. And it wasn't just me who was impacted. It was the entire community. I could feel the shift happening, the tension, the growing awareness that Patricia had made a grave mistake. As the police continued their investigation, I stood there, watching the scene unfold. The sense of justice was slow, but it was coming. I knew Patricia's days as HOA president were numbered, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of vindication. Her actions had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. She had tried to control the community with her rules and her power, but in the end, it was her own recklessness that would bring her down. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. The police were taking this seriously. And soon, Patricia would have to answer for what she had done. The following days unfolded like a dramatic unraveling, one that neither I nor anyone in the neighborhood could have predicted. It wasn't just the shock of Patricia's actions that weighed heavily on me, it was the realization of how deeply she had wounded the trust and sense of community we once had in Maple Grove Estates. Her actions were far from a simple act of petty revenge, they were reckless, dangerous, and deeply destructive. As the truth came to light, the atmosphere shifted from disbelief to outrage. It wasn't long before the media caught wind of what had happened. News outlets flocked to the story, drawn not only to the scandal but to the larger implications of what Patricia had done. The reporter's voice echoed through the streets of our neighborhood, his words laced with the sensationalism that only such a shocking turn of events could inspire. "New developments in the Maple Grove case," he said, standing in front of the community center, his face serious. "Patricia Wellington, the recently arrested president of the Homeowners Association, may have violated not only local laws but federal regulations. Sources tell us this is a developing story with far-reaching implications." I could hardly believe it. The very woman who had promised to restore the community's glory had instead torn it apart. The documents that surfaced soon after revealed a history Patricia had gone to great lengths to hide. It wasn't just the solar panels that had made her snap, it was the fact that her sense of control had been threatened. It turned out that Patricia had been forced to resign from another HOA board years ago for implementing similarly aggressive, authoritarian policies that had alienated the residents and caused chaos. She had hidden this detail from us, hoping her picture-perfect campaign would mask her true intentions. The more people dug, the more they uncovered about her unsavory past. The story began to spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had never spoken out about the HOA now found themselves questioning everything. How had they allowed her to rise to power? How had they trusted someone with such a glaring disregard for others' safety and well-being? For some, it was a wake-up call to the way power had been so easily abused. For others, it was a realization of how naive they had been, following Patricia's promises without ever questioning the true cost of her control. When the HOA called for an emergency meeting, the community center was filled beyond capacity. There wasn't a single empty seat. The residents who had once quietly complied with HOA guidelines now stood shoulder to shoulder, some clutching printouts of their damage claims, others simply brimming with the anger that had been brewing since the blackout. The air was thick with a palpable sense of betrayal. It was no longer just about a few solar panels, it was about the trust that had been shattered, the disruption of our peaceful lives. Patricia sat at the front, her posture no longer the confident, domineering presence it had once been. Her hair, usually flawless, was disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled and out of place. She was no longer the poised, untouchable figure she had once portrayed herself as. There was no mistaking it now, she was unraveling before our eyes. And she knew it. She sat there, her lawyer whispering in her ear, but the words couldn't save her. Not now. The vice president of the HOA called the meeting to order, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "We've received dozens of complaints, and we are taking them very seriously," he said, his tone even but grave. The residents exchanged knowing glances, their frustration growing as they realized how badly Patricia's actions had affected everyone. One by one, the neighbors took the floor, recounting the damages they had sustained. Mrs. Peterson across the street spoke of the terror she felt when the power went out, knowing that her medical equipment relied on a constant electricity supply. Other residents shared stories of ruined food, destroyed electronics, and the chaos that followed the outage. The flood of testimonies was overwhelming, but it also revealed the extent to which Patricia's sabotage had harmed the entire community. It wasn't just about the inconvenience, lives had been disrupted, homes had been damaged, and we had all been put at risk. But the moment that truly made the entire room stop was when Mr. Johnson, the neighborhood accountant, stood up. He had taken the time to calculate the financial impact of Patricia's actions, looking at how the solar panels had lowered the utility costs for the entire subdivision. "Those solar panels helped reduce our collective energy bills," he said, pointing to the roof of my house. "By cutting the lines, Mrs. Wellington didn't just damage your home, she harmed all of us." His words rang out in the silence that followed. It was a truth Patricia couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried to justify herself. "I was just trying to maintain our community standards," she insisted, her voice shaking with a mix of defensiveness and desperation. "Those panels are an eyesore. We need to protect the integrity of Maple Grove Estates." But her words were no longer convincing. They sounded hollow and out of place in a room full of people who had seen the destruction her actions had caused. A woman who had once wielded her position like a weapon now looked small and insignificant. The room buzzed with frustration, and one by one, neighbors began to speak out against her, pointing out how her actions had caused them not just financial losses, but emotional and personal distress. The final blow came when the HOA's insurance representative stood up, his face grim. "Due to the intentional nature of Mrs. Wellington's actions, our insurance policy won't cover the damages," he announced. "She is personally liable for all repairs and compensation claims." The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Patricia's face drained of color as the weight of what she had done truly settled in. Her lawyer, who had been furiously scribbling notes, looked up, his expression grim. There was no escaping it now. She was done. The vote to remove her from the board was swift, unanimous, and inevitable. It was clear that the trust she had so carefully cultivated was gone, and with it, her power. As she fled the meeting, her face flushed with embarrassment, I felt a strange mix of relief and vindication. This was what she had brought upon herself. But more than that, it was a victory for the community. We had fought back, not just against her, but against the toxicity she had injected into our lives. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, but also of change. The HOA introduced new guidelines, ones that encouraged sustainable practices and fostered a sense of unity rather than division. More residents installed solar panels, and the neighborhood began to embrace more environmentally friendly solutions. We even set up a program to help senior residents maintain their properties, ensuring that something like this would never happen again. As for Patricia, she put her house on the market within 2 weeks. I heard she moved to a neighborhood without an HOA, likely the best move for someone who could no longer handle the scrutiny of a community she had once ruled with an iron fist. I saw her one last time, standing by the moving truck, carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone. It was as if she couldn't face the people she had wronged, the people she had tried to control. My solar panels are still up there, working perfectly, a testament to both the resilience of the community and the victory over one woman's attempt to dominate us. Every time the sunlight hits them just right, I can't help but smile. They seem to shine a little brighter, as if they know they've won. And every time I get my reduced energy bill, I think about sending Patricia a copy. But I don't need to. Living well, sustainably, and peacefully, without the weight of her manipulation, is the best revenge. The final HOA meeting was unlike any other I had experienced in Maple Grove. The atmosphere was electric with tension, a quiet but palpable anticipation hanging in the air. The room was packed, the air heavy with voices murmuring in hushed conversations, all focused on the same thing, the fate of Patricia Wellington and her controversial reign as HOA president. I had never seen this many people gathered in one place for an HOA meeting. It was almost surreal, the way the room buzzed with the shared weight of the moment. I could feel it in my bones, the collective frustration, the disbelief, and the rising anger over what had happened. Every single one of us was here because we had been wronged, because Patricia's actions had not only disrupted our lives but had harmed our community. As I entered the meeting room, my eyes naturally went to Patricia. She sat near the front, but the confident, self-assured woman I had once seen was nowhere to be found. She was no longer the picture of the perfectly put-together HOA president, with her pristine blonde hair and expensive designer outfits. Now, she looked deflated. Her hair was messier than usual, and the look in her eyes was a mix of fear and defiance, the latter barely masking her anxiety. She was still holding tightly to the belief that she could somehow get out of this, but it was clear to anyone who looked at her that she knew the end was near. The battle had been lost. James, the interim HOA president, stood up to call the meeting to order. His voice was firm and resolute, the kind of voice that commanded attention. There was no hesitation in his words, and the way he held himself made it clear that this was not a time for weak compromises or polite gestures. He was here to do what was right, no matter the consequences. "We are gathered here tonight to address the actions of one of our own," he began, his gaze sweeping the room. "This meeting is not about protecting egos or personal interests. This is about restoring the balance in our community, about ensuring that no one is above the rules. Mrs. Wellington's actions have caused irreversible damage to this neighborhood, and it's time we make that clear." His words hit me like a wave. There it was, the truth we had all been holding back for so long. This wasn't just about solar panels. This was about Patricia's abuse of power, her disregard for the well-being of her neighbors, and her self-serving manipulation of the HOA's authority. Every single person in the room had suffered because of her, and now it was time to make her face the consequences. Patricia shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny, but she wasn't about to back down. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering in her ear, but she shook her head, her lips tight, as if trying to gather the strength to stand her ground. But there was nothing she could say that could change the facts. The damage had been done, and she had no one to blame but herself. When the moment came to vote on Patricia's removal from the HOA board, the room fell into an eerie silence. My heart pounded in my chest, the anticipation almost unbearable. This was it, the culmination of months of tension, fear, and frustration. It was hard to believe we had come this far, but now that we had, there was no turning back. I could feel the weight of every person's gaze as they watched the board members cast their votes. The moment the vote was announced, a wave of relief surged through me. The majority of the board members had voted to remove Patricia. It was a unanimous decision. I could feel my chest tighten with a mixture of vindication and satisfaction. This was the justice we had been waiting for, the proof that we could stand together and make a difference. Patricia had lost, and the community had won. Her reaction was exactly what I expected. She stood up quickly, her face pale with disbelief and anger, and without another word, she rushed out of the room. She didn't even look back at us. Her heels clicked sharply on the floor, a sound that felt like a punctuation mark to the end of her reign. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph as I watched her leave. She had been defeated, and she knew it. As the meeting continued, there was a new sense of hope in the air. People started to speak up about the changes they wanted to see in the HOA moving forward. No longer were we the silent, passive residents who had been under Patricia's thumb. Now, we were active participants in shaping the future of our community. It felt empowering, like we were taking back control, not just from Patricia, but from the fear and frustration that had been building for so long. I glanced around the room, taking in the faces of my neighbors. Many of them were smiling, their eyes filled with relief and hope. Some of them had suffered financial losses, others had dealt with the emotional toll of living under Patricia's tyrannical rule. But now, they were all standing together, ready to rebuild. The air in the room had shifted, and it was no longer heavy with tension, but light with the promise of a fresh start. As the meeting came to a close, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. We had done it. Patricia was gone, and the community was free to move forward. I walked out of the room slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had happened lift off my shoulders. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow on the neighborhood. For the first time in a long while, I could see the future clearly, a future where we could all live in harmony, where every voice mattered. As I reached my house, I looked up at my solar panels. They were still there, their sleek surfaces gleaming in the fading light. Despite everything, they had withstood the storm. And so had we. I couldn't help but smile, knowing that in the end, we had triumphed over the darkness. After Patricia's departure, the transformation in Maple Grove was profound, far beyond what any of us had expected. The change wasn't immediate, it took time for people to trust that things would genuinely be different, but the difference was undeniable. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving the neighborhood to breathe again, free from the oppressive reign of the former HOA president. No longer were we at the mercy of her strict rules and arbitrary decisions. We could now see that the community was capable of growth, not stifled by a single person's agenda. The first shift was the board's decision to pass new HOA guidelines, a stark contrast to the rigid, outdated policies Patricia had imposed. The new rules encouraged the installation of solar panels, recognizing them not as eyesores but as a progressive step toward sustainability. This was a relief, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. We had lived in constant fear that any sign of modernity or environmental consciousness would be penalized, but now the guidelines were finally in line with what so many of us had wanted all along. For me, this moment felt like a victory, not just because my solar panels were no longer a point of contention, but because the HOA was taking a step toward embracing the future. Over the next few weeks, the sense of freedom and possibility began to grow. More of my neighbors started installing their own solar panels, encouraged by the new rules and the understanding that they were now part of something bigger, something that contributed to reducing energy costs for everyone. I watched as the community embraced sustainability, not just as a personal benefit, but as something that would enhance the neighborhood as a whole. It was a collective victory, and it gave me a sense of pride that was hard to describe. I had fought not only for my own rights but for the community's future, and it felt good to see those efforts paying off. The community's transformation didn't stop at solar energy. The HOA had also introduced a new initiative to help senior residents with property maintenance. This was something that had been long overdue. Under Patricia's leadership, there had been little consideration for the elderly, who often struggled to keep their lawns and homes in pristine condition. Now, the neighborhood was offering support to ensure they didn't feel alienated or burdened by upkeep tasks. Volunteers came together to help with landscaping, cleaning, and general maintenance. It felt heartwarming to watch as the community, once fractured by selfish interests, now worked together to help those who needed it the most. It was a reminder that people are capable of kindness when given the opportunity. Another change that brought the community closer together was the creation of a community garden. For years, the idea had been mentioned, but it had always been shut down by the previous administration, deemed too impractical or unnecessary. With Patricia gone, however, the idea was finally brought to life. The garden became a focal point, a symbol of our neighborhood's commitment to each other and to the environment. It was amazing to see people of all ages coming together, planting flowers, vegetables, and herbs. The garden didn't just beautify the area, it connected us. It gave us something to share, something to nurture together. And as the garden flourished, so did our relationships. It wasn't just about the plants, it was about the bonds we were forming. The best part was seeing the sense of community that had been lost under Patricia's leadership slowly being restored. The once dreaded HOA meetings, which had been nothing more than arenas for conflict and control, were now places where we could share ideas, voice concerns, and make decisions together. It was no longer about maintaining a perfect, pristine image. It was about supporting one another, making sure our neighborhood was a place where everyone could feel comfortable, where diversity of thought and lifestyle was respected, and where no one person could dictate the fate of the entire community. As I walked around the neighborhood, seeing people chat and laugh, talking about their plans for the garden or the latest energy-saving tips, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about my solar panels, it was about the community coming together to create something better, something that would last. Every time I looked at the new solar panels being installed around me, it felt like a small victory, not just for me, but for the future of Maple Grove Estates. In the months that followed, the changes didn't just feel real, they felt permanent. People began organizing neighborhood events, from block parties to potlucks, to celebrate the renewed sense of camaraderie that had taken root. It was no longer a community living in fear of being fined or reprimanded by an oppressive HOA board. We were a neighborhood that genuinely cared for each other, worked together, and took pride in our collective achievements. I realized that this sense of unity and shared purpose was far more important than any solar panel or environmental initiative. We had rebuilt something far more valuable than the appearance of perfection. We had built trust and respect. For me, the journey from conflict to resolution was one of growth, not just as a homeowner but as a person. I had learned the importance of standing up for what was right, of not letting others impose their narrow views on you. But more importantly, I had learned the value of working with others toward a common goal, of putting aside differences for the greater good. Looking around at the changes, I felt a quiet pride. What had started as a battle over solar panels had turned into a movement that transformed an entire neighborhood. And in that moment, I knew that this wasn't just about winning against Patricia, it was about making Maple Grove Estates a place where everyone had a voice, where cooperation and kindness could flourish, and where the future was filled with endless possibilities. The days following Patricia's downfall were marked by a sense of bittersweet closure. The storm she had stirred up in the community had calmed, but the aftermath left a sharp, undeniable taste of victory, one that was hard-earned, but still, undeniably sweet. Patricia had always believed she was untouchable, her lofty position as HOA president cemented by her manipulation of the board and the residents. Her idea of restoring Maple Grove to its former glory was nothing more than a guise for her own rigid, controlling vision of perfection. She wanted everything, and everyone, to fall in line with her ideals, no matter the cost. But now, as she stood at the edge of her property, her carefully constructed world was crumbling. The news of her actions had spread like wildfire, and as the weeks wore on, the full extent of her past began to emerge. Residents unearthed documents revealing her previous forced resignation from another HOA, an event she had conveniently hidden from her campaign. It was clear now, Patricia's obsession with control and her attempts to push people into submission had never been limited to just our neighborhood. And in her zeal to enforce her ideals, she had alienated those she was supposed to serve. The lawsuit filed against her by the community wasn't just a financial blow, it was the culmination of all the anger and frustration she had fueled in the people around her. The entire neighborhood had felt the sting of her carelessness, but it was the people who had suffered most from the power outage, those who had lost food, medical supplies, and critical equipment, that formed the heart of the case. They wanted justice, and they weren't about to let her off easy. Watching her during the community meeting, when the full weight of her actions came crashing down on her, was like witnessing the unraveling of a tightly wound knot. Patricia, once so poised, so confident in her superiority, was now visibly sweating. She tried to maintain her composure, but her usual sharpness had been replaced with desperation. Her voice, once commanding, wavered as she struggled to defend the indefensible. Every word she spoke seemed to dig her deeper into a hole of self-deceit. "I was just trying to maintain community standards," she pleaded, her eyes darting around the room. But her words held no power. The facts were irrefutable. Neighbors recounted the financial costs, the emotional stress, the fear that had gripped them when the power went out. And then came the final blow. The insurance representative's cold, calculated delivery of the news that Patricia's actions had made the HOA's insurance policy null and void sealed her fate. "You're personally liable for all repairs and resident claims," he stated, and I saw Patricia's face drain of color. The weight of her mistakes was now pressing down on her, and she knew, in that moment, that her reign was over. The vote to remove her from the board was unanimous. There was no coming back from this. The next few days were a blur of tension. While Patricia avoided most of the community, hiding behind closed curtains in her home, the residents began to mobilize. Their anger, once simmering beneath the surface, now had a focus. They filed their damage claims, spoke to lawyers, and began to demand accountability for everything Patricia had done. Her betrayal of the community was not something they were going to forgive easily. When I saw her again, just 2 weeks after her forced resignation, it was in the final stages of her departure from Maple Grove. Her once pristine house, the one that had symbolized her perfect, controlled world, was now being emptied. Movers took away the last of her belongings, but there was something hollow in the air. Her perfect lawn was no longer manicured, her house no longer gleamed with the brightness of her former perfection. She moved with urgency, almost frantic, avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. Her face, which had once been so carefully composed, now looked pale and strained. She was no longer the confident, commanding figure she had once been. The sight of her trying so hard to maintain some semblance of control, even in this moment of defeat, felt almost pitiful. I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction, though not the kind that came from a personal victory. No, this was the satisfaction that comes from seeing someone who had used their power for selfish reasons face the consequences of their actions. She had thought that by cutting my power lines, she could make me bend to her will, but in doing so, she had caused more damage than she could ever have imagined. And now, she was paying the price. Patricia's departure from Maple Grove was the end of an era, but not in the way she had imagined. She had come into this neighborhood with dreams of re-establishing control, of imposing her own vision of what the community should look like. Instead, she had shattered the trust of the very people she had sworn to serve. And as she left, dragging the remnants of her former life with her, I knew that this would be the last time we would see her. The house that had once represented her dominance in the community would now stand as a reminder of her fall from grace. There was a sense of finality to it all, a sense of victory not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. Maple Grove had been through a lot, but we had survived. We had stood together, fought for what was right, and reclaimed our community. We had defeated someone who had used fear and control to manipulate us, and now we were stronger because of it. As Patricia's car drove away, her house sitting empty behind her, I felt a quiet pride. We had faced down her tyranny, and we had won. The changes that followed were the most lasting testament to our resilience. We had taken the chaos Patricia caused and turned it into something positive. New guidelines were adopted, embracing sustainable energy solutions, and residents who had once been afraid to speak up now had a voice in the community. People who had been disconnected from one another came together, stronger than before. And as for me, my solar panels, once the center of a bitter dispute, now stood as a symbol of our victory. Every time the sunlight hit them, they seemed to shine a little brighter, perhaps as a reminder that, in the end, doing the right thing always wins. Patricia's downfall was a lesson for all of us. Power, when used carelessly and selfishly, can only last so long. The community that stands together, with integrity and respect, will always come out on top. And I couldn't help but think that, in the end, the biggest mistake Patricia made wasn't cutting my power lines, it was underestimating the strength of the people she tried to control.